45 years ago, beneath an old oak tree behind Lincoln High School in the quiet town of Maplewood, Ohio, 17-year-old Daniel Brooks looked into the eyes of 17-year-old Sarah Mitchell and made a promise that seemed impossible to break. They were young enough to believe that love could survive anything and old enough to mean every word they spoke. As the late afternoon sun filtered through the branches above them, Daniel gently held Sarah's hands and whispered that no matter where life took them, they would always find their way back to each other. Sarah smiled through tears and promised the same. Neither of them could have imagined that within only a few weeks, one of them would disappear without a single goodbye. No letter, no phone call, no explanation. Daniel spent the next 45 years believing that the only girl he had ever truly loved had simply decided to leave him behind. But when Daniel reached the age of 71, one unexpected phone call uncovered a truth so heartbreaking that it changed everything he thought he knew about his first love, his past, and the life he believed he had lost forever. Most people believe first love belongs only to youth. It becomes a collection of fading photographs, forgotten songs on the radio, and memories that slowly lose their sharp edges with time. But every so often, life tells a very different story. Sometimes the people we believe abandoned us were carrying burdens we never knew existed. Sometimes decades of heartbreak can be traced back to a single decision made by someone else. And sometimes the greatest love story of a lifetime does not begin with a wedding. Sometimes it begins with a misunderstanding that lasts nearly half a century. Daniel Brooks spent most of his adult life convincing himself that he had moved on. He married, raised a family, built a successful career, and became the kind of dependable husband and father every community respected. Yet there was one part of his heart that never fully accepted the ending of his first chapter. Every anniversary of his high school graduation quietly reminded him of the promise made beneath that old oak tree. Every visit back to Maplewood stirred memories he tried hard to bury. He told himself that some questions simply were never meant to be answered. He was wrong. Before we go deeper into this unforgettable story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stories like this remind us that life has a remarkable way of surprising us when we least expect it. And today's story may change the way you think about love, forgiveness, and second chances forever. To understand how two people could lose 45 years together, we have to return to the autumn of 1977. Daniel Brooks was 17 years old, a quiet young man who preferred fixing old cars with his father to seeking attention. While many of his classmates dreamed of leaving their small hometown as quickly as possible, Daniel appreciated the simple rhythm of life in Maplewood. He believed happiness came from honest work, loyal friends, and the people who stood beside you when life became difficult. Sarah Mitchell, also 17 years old, possessed a warmth that seemed to brighten every hallway she walked through. She excelled in school, volunteered at the local library on weekends, and dreamed of becoming an elementary school teacher. Friends often joked that Daniel and Sarah balanced each other perfectly. Daniel rarely spoke unless he had something meaningful to say, while Sarah could start a conversation with almost anyone and make them feel like the most important person in the room. Together, they became one of those couples everyone quietly expected to grow old together. Their relationship was never built on expensive gifts or dramatic declarations. It grew through countless ordinary moments that slowly became extraordinary. Friday night football games where Sarah cheered from the sidelines while Daniel sat in the stands after finishing work at the local hardware store. Long walks home after school beneath rows of maple trees whose leaves painted the sidewalks gold and crimson. Milkshakes shared at the neighborhood diner where the waitress already knew their usual order before they sat down. Every Saturday afternoon, they visited the old oak tree behind Lincoln High School, a place that slowly became their own private world. There they talked about everything two 17-year-olds could imagine. They discussed college, marriage, children, careers, and the kind of home they hope to build someday. Daniel often carried a small notebook where he wrote future goals, and Sarah loved teasing him that he planned every detail of life except how to surprise her. Looking back decades later, Daniel would admit that those afternoons beneath the old oak tree remain the happiest memories of his entire youth. They had no way of knowing that forces completely outside their control were already beginning to shape the course of their lives. Decisions were being made in quiet conversations behind closed doors. Adults believed they knew what was best. Assumptions replaced honest conversations. Pride silenced explanations that should have been spoken aloud. Daniel and Sarah continued making plans for graduation, completely unaware that time was quietly running out. Neither imagined that before they both turned 18, every promise they had made beneath that tree would be tested in a way neither love nor determination could overcome. And when the moment finally arrived, it would leave one young man searching for answers that would not come for the next 45 years. There are moments in life that seem ordinary while they're happening, only to become the memories that define an entire lifetime. For Michael Turner, those moments began in the fall of 1977, when he was 17 years old and entering his final year at Lincoln High School in the small town of Maplewood, Ohio. It was the kind of American town where everyone recognized one another by name, where the hardware store owner knew your grandfather, where Friday night football games brought the entire community together, and where neighbors still waved from their front porches as the sun settled behind rows of maple trees. Life moved at a slower pace there. People trusted one another. Doors were often left unlocked during the day, and young couples believed the future was waiting just beyond graduation. Michael never imagined that one decision made during that school year would shape the next 54 years of his life. At 17 years old, he wasn't searching for an unforgettable love story. He was simply trying to finish school, help his father at the local auto repair garage after classes, and save enough money to buy the used pickup truck he had admired for months. Friends described him as dependable, respectful, and quiet. He wasn't the loudest student in the hallway or the captain of every sports team. Instead, he earned people's respect through honesty, hard work, and a willingness to help anyone who needed him. Teachers often said Michael carried himself with the maturity of someone much older, although even they could not have guessed how much life would eventually ask him to endure. Rebecca, whom everyone affectionately called Becky Hayes, was also 17 years old and entering her senior year at Lincoln High School. She possessed the rare ability to make people feel comfortable almost immediately after meeting them. Her smile carried genuine warmth, and her kindness was never performed for attention. She volunteered at the local public library on Saturday mornings, tutored younger students struggling with reading, and dreamed of becoming an elementary school teacher after college. Becky believed every child deserved someone who believed in them, perhaps because she understood how powerful encouragement could be. Her parents expected excellence in everything she did, and while she respected them deeply, those expectations often weighed heavily on her shoulders. To classmates, Becky appeared confident and cheerful, but very few people realized how much pressure she quietly carried every day. She longed for a future where she could make her own decisions, build her own family, and create a home filled with the warmth she often imagined while reading classic American novels at the library. At 17 years old, she had no reason to believe those dreams would ever be interrupted. Michael first truly noticed Becky during the second week of the school year. Although they had attended the same school for years, their paths had rarely crossed beyond a polite greeting in the hallway. That changed when their American history teacher assigned a semester-long project requiring students to work in pairs. Fate, coincidence, or perhaps something much greater placed Michael Turner and Becky Hayes at the same table that September morning. Neither of them knew it then, but a simple classroom assignment would become the beginning of a story neither time nor distance could erase. Michael later admitted that he struggled to concentrate during that first conversation because Becky listened with such genuine interest that she made even his ordinary thoughts seem important. Becky would later tell a close friend that Michael was different from every other boy she had ever met because he never tried to impress her. He simply spoke honestly, laughed naturally, and treated everyone around him with quiet respect. Their history project quickly became an excuse to spend more time together after school, researching at the town library before walking home beneath streets lined with towering oak and maple trees. Neither realized that those walks would soon become the highlight of every day, or that each shared conversation was laying the foundation for a promise that would echo across the next 45 years. As the weeks passed, the history project that had first brought 17-year-old Michael Turner and 17-year-old Rebecca Becky Hayes together quietly became an excuse neither of them wanted to lose. Their research had long been completed, yet they continued meeting after school almost every afternoon. Sometimes they studied at the Maplewood Public Library until the librarian gently reminded them it was closing time. Other days they wandered through the town square with paper cups of hot chocolate in their hands as autumn slowly surrendered to the first signs of winter. They discovered how naturally silence existed between them. There was never any pressure to keep talking, simply to fill the quiet. Michael would occasionally point toward an old building and tell Becky stories his grandfather had shared about the town, while Becky laughed at the way he became animated whenever he spoke about restoring classic cars with his father. Those conversations revealed pieces of themselves they had never shown anyone else. Michael admitted he worried about whether he could ever afford college, while Becky confessed that she sometimes feared disappointing her parents if her future did not unfold exactly as they expected. Instead of judging one another, they listened. Looking back decades later, Michael would remember that being heard was the first moment he truly understood what love felt like. By late October, almost everyone at Lincoln High School had noticed the change. Friends smiled whenever Michael and Becky entered the cafeteria together. Teachers occasionally exchanged knowing glances when the two volunteered for the same classroom activities. Even the elderly waitress at Miller's Diner, where they often stopped after football games, greeted them with the same playful question every Friday night. She would ask whether they wanted one milkshake with 2 straws or 2 separate milkshakes, and Becky always laughed before Michael could become embarrassed. Those simple evenings became treasured rituals. They would sit in the same booth near the window, watching headlights pass along Main Street, while talking about everything from favorite childhood memories to the places they hoped to visit someday. Becky dreamed of seeing the beaches of California, while Michael wanted nothing more than to drive across America in an old pickup truck with someone who enjoyed the journey more than the destination. Neither of them realized they were quietly describing the same future, one that included the other in every dream without ever needing to say it aloud. As Thanksgiving approached, their relationship deepened in ways that had nothing to do with grand romantic gestures. Michael noticed that Becky always carried an extra pair of gloves in her school bag because she knew someone would eventually forget theirs on a cold morning. Becky admired the way Michael instinctively helped elderly neighbors carry groceries without expecting thanks or recognition. These were the details that convinced them they had found someone extraordinary. Love was growing not because of dramatic moments, but because of countless acts of quiet kindness repeated day after day. One Saturday afternoon, Michael invited Becky to the auto repair garage where he worked alongside his father. While many teenagers might have been bored by the smell of motor oil and the sight of worn-out engines, Becky seemed genuinely fascinated. She watched Michael patiently rebuild an old carburetor and smiled as his father proudly explained that his son could repair almost any engine placed in front of him. Later that evening, Michael's father gently pulled him aside and said something that would stay with him forever. He told his 17-year-old son that truly good people did not come into a person's life very often, and when they did, they deserved to be appreciated every single day. Michael quietly nodded, never imagining how painfully those words would echo through the decades ahead. December arrived with the first snowfall covering Maplewood in white, transforming familiar streets into scenes that seemed lifted from a Christmas postcard. Lincoln High School prepared for its annual winter dance, and although Michael was nervous, he finally gathered the courage to ask Becky if she would go with him. Before he could even finish the question, she smiled and accepted. That evening became one neither of them would ever forget. Beneath strings of lights decorating the school gymnasium, 17-year-old Michael Turner and 17-year-old Becky Hayes shared their first slow dance. As the music played softly around them, the crowded room seemed to disappear. Michael later admitted there was only one moment in his life that matched the happiness he felt that night, and it would not arrive until 45 years later. When the dance ended, he walked Becky home through gently falling snow. Standing outside her front porch, he hesitated for just a moment before taking her hand. She looked into his eyes, smiled, and whispered that she had hoped he would do that all evening. It was a simple sentence, yet it confirmed what both of them had already begun to understand. They were no longer just two classmates spending time together. They had become each other's safest place, each other's greatest hope for the future, and without realizing it, they were beginning to build a love story that neither time nor distance would ever completely erase. By the time Christmas arrived in December of 1977, 17-year-old Michael Turner could no longer remember what life had felt like before Becky Hayes became part of his everyday routine. Somewhere between their afternoons at the library, long walks through Maplewood, and quiet evenings sharing milkshakes at Miller's Diner, Becky had become the first person he wanted to tell whenever something good happened and the first person he thought about whenever something went wrong. It wasn't a sudden change. There had been no single dramatic moment that transformed friendship into love. Instead, it happened so gradually that neither of them noticed until they realized they had begun making every future plan together. Michael no longer talked about buying an old pickup truck simply because he wanted one. Now he joked that it needed to have enough room for Becky to ride beside him on every road trip they would someday take. Becky stopped speaking about becoming an elementary school teacher as though it were only her dream. She began saying that she hoped one day Michael would restore classic cars while she taught children in the same small town where they planned to raise a family. They spoke about those dreams with the confidence only 17-year-olds possess, believing life would naturally reward honesty, loyalty, and love. They had never experienced the kind of heartbreak that teaches people to expect disappointment. As far as they were concerned, their future was already written. The Christmas season transformed Maplewood into the kind of town people remembered fondly decades later. Main Street sparkled beneath strings of colorful lights hanging between telephone poles. Local shop owners decorated their storefront windows with handmade displays. Children gathered around the enormous Christmas tree in the town square every weekend, and families filled the sidewalks carrying shopping bags while greeting neighbors they had known for years. Michael and Becky spent nearly every free afternoon together during winter break. They volunteered at the church's annual food drive, helped elderly residents shovel snow from their driveways after heavy storms, and attended the community Christmas concert where the entire audience joined together to sing holiday songs before the evening ended. Watching Becky interact with everyone around her only deepened Michael's feelings. She remembered the names of elderly widows living alone, knelt to speak kindly with shy children who were nervous around strangers, and somehow managed to make every person she met feel valued. Michael often found himself simply watching her from across a room, quietly wondering how someone so thoughtful had chosen him. He had never considered himself extraordinary. Yet whenever Becky looked back at him with that familiar smile, she made him believe he could become the man she already seemed to think he was. Although their relationship appeared effortless on the surface, Becky occasionally revealed glimpses of worries she rarely shared with anyone else. Her father believed success meant following a carefully planned path. He expected Becky to attend a respected university, earn outstanding grades, and avoid anything that might distract her from those goals. While he never openly objected to Michael, Becky sensed he viewed teenage romance as something temporary, an obstacle rather than an opportunity. One evening after leaving church, she quietly admitted that her parents often spoke about moving if the right career opportunity appeared. Michael stopped walking for a moment before asking whether they were seriously considering leaving Maplewood. Becky quickly shook her head and smiled, explaining that nothing had been decided and that her father mentioned possibilities all the time without acting on them. She squeezed Michael's hand and assured him there was no reason to worry. He wanted to believe her, and for the moment he did. Yet that brief conversation planted the smallest seed of uncertainty deep inside his heart. It was the first time either of them acknowledged that life might not unfold exactly as they had imagined. Neither realized how important that conversation would eventually become. As New Year's Day approached, Michael decided he wanted to give Becky something meaningful. Working extra hours at his father's repair garage throughout the holiday break, he carefully saved enough money to purchase a delicate silver necklace from a family-owned jewelry store on Main Street. It wasn't expensive by most standards, but to a 17-year-old earning modest wages after school, it represented weeks of hard work and sacrifice. The pendant was simple, shaped like a tiny oak leaf, reminding him of the massive tree standing behind Lincoln High School, where they spent so many afternoons talking about their dreams. When he handed Becky the small wrapped box during their New Year's walk through the snow-covered town park, she opened it slowly, her eyes immediately filling with tears. She gently traced the little silver leaf with her fingertips before looking up at Michael, unable to speak for several moments. Finally, she whispered that no gift had ever meant so much because it represented a place that already felt like home whenever they were together. She asked Michael to fasten the necklace around her neck, promising she would wear it every day as a reminder that no matter where life eventually led them, a part of her heart would always remain beneath that old oak tree. Michael smiled, believing it was simply another beautiful promise between two young people in love. He had no idea that decades later, the memory of that necklace would become one of the most powerful reminders of everything they had lost and everything they still hoped might somehow be found again. The new year of 1978 arrived with excitement filling the halls of Lincoln High School. Graduation was only a few months away, and conversations among seniors increasingly focused on college acceptance letters, summer jobs, military service, and plans for adulthood. While many classmates felt anxious about leaving behind the only life they had ever known, Michael and Becky welcomed the future with optimism. They often laughed about returning to Maplewood years later with children of their own, pointing toward Lincoln High School and telling stories about how two nervous 17-year-olds had unknowingly fallen in love inside its classrooms. To everyone around them, they appeared inseparable. Friends joked that if someone invited Michael somewhere, Becky would certainly be there as well, and the opposite was equally true. Even teachers who rarely commented on students' personal lives quietly remarked that the two seemed to bring out the very best in each other. Looking back after 45 years, many of those classmates would admit they never doubted Michael Turner and Rebecca Becky Hayes would eventually marry. In fact, if someone had asked the graduating class to predict which couple was most likely to celebrate 50 years together, nearly every hand would have pointed toward them. That certainty made what happened next even more difficult to understand, because within only a few short months, one of them would vanish without a goodbye, leaving behind questions that would remain unanswered until both of them reached 71 years of age. And the heartbreaking truth had already begun moving quietly toward them, hidden inside a decision neither of them knew had been made. By the beginning of February 1978, 17-year-old Michael Turner and 17-year-old Rebecca Becky Hayes had become more than simply the couple everyone admired at Lincoln High School. In many ways, they had become part of the identity of Maplewood itself. On Friday evenings, townspeople expected to see them sitting together in the front row of the basketball games. On Saturday mornings, They could often be found helping organize community events or walking through Main Street with cups of coffee from the small cafe that had been owned by the same family for generations. Older couples smiled whenever Michael politely opened doors for Becky or instinctively reached for her hand while crossing the street. Those small gestures reminded them of a different era, when love was measured less by grand displays and more by consistency, loyalty, and quiet acts of care. Michael never thought about whether someone was watching. He simply treated Becky the way he believed every woman deserved to be treated. Becky, in return, never allowed a day to pass without reminding Michael how grateful she was for his kindness. Looking back decades later, people who knew them during those years often said their relationship never appeared forced or dramatic. It simply looked as though two people had naturally found the person they had been searching for all along. As graduation grew closer, conversations about the future became more serious. One chilly Saturday afternoon, Michael drove Becky to a hill overlooking Maplewood, a place where local teenagers often gathered to watch the sunset. Sitting on the hood of his father's old pickup truck, wrapped in blankets against the cold, they spoke honestly about adulthood for the first time. Michael admitted he planned to continue working with his father for a few years before opening an auto repair shop of his own. It wasn't an ambitious dream by the standards of big cities, but it was one built on hard work and honesty. Becky listened carefully before sharing that she had received acceptance letters from 2 universities, both offering teacher education programs. Although she was excited, she quietly confessed that leaving Maplewood frightened her. She had never wanted success if it meant losing the people she loved most. Michael reached over, took her hand, and gently reminded her that no matter where she studied, they would find a way to stay together. They spoke about weekend visits, handwritten letters, long-distance phone calls, and eventually building a home back in Maplewood after graduation from college. Their plans sounded simple, even ordinary, yet they carried the certainty of 2 17-year-olds who believed that love, determination, and patience could overcome any obstacle life placed before them. Only a few days later, Valentine's Day arrived, bringing with it a memory Michael would carry for the next 54 years. He had secretly spent weeks carving a small wooden keepsake box in his father's garage during quiet evenings after work. He wasn't an experienced craftsman, and the finished box contained tiny imperfections that would have disappointed anyone seeking perfection. But every rough edge represented hours of effort poured into something created entirely by hand. Inside the box, he placed a folded note that read, "For every letter we write, every memory we make, and every promise we keep." Becky was overwhelmed when she opened it. Tears immediately filled her eyes as she carefully traced the carved initials on the lid, M and B, surrounded by the outline of an oak leaf. She told Michael she had never received anything more thoughtful because it wasn't something purchased from a store. It was something built with patience, love, and time. She promised she would use the box to keep every letter he ever wrote her, no matter how many years passed. Neither of them realized how painfully those words would one day return. The very object meant to preserve their memories would eventually become a silent witness to the heartbreaking truth that the letters they desperately wanted to exchange would never reach their intended destination. As winter slowly gave way to the first hints of spring, subtle changes began appearing in Becky's life, although Michael initially paid little attention to them. Becky occasionally arrived at school looking unusually tired, explaining that her parents had been arguing late into the night about important family decisions. Sometimes she became distracted during conversations, staring quietly through classroom windows before quickly smiling again whenever Michael asked if everything was all right. She always assured him there was nothing to worry about, insisting her father was simply dealing with pressures at work. Michael believed her because trust had become the foundation of their relationship. He had no reason to suspect she was hiding anything from him, nor did he realize Becky herself knew very little about what was unfolding inside her own home. Late at night, after she had gone to bed, her parents often discussed opportunities, finances, and possibilities they intentionally kept from their daughter until they believed the time was right. Becky sensed something was changing, but she could not yet see the full picture. Neither could Michael. They continued making plans for graduation, choosing songs they hoped would be played at the senior dance, discussing where they might celebrate after the ceremony, and dreaming about the summer that awaited them. Every conversation assumed they would face the future side by side. One afternoon in early March, after classes had ended, Michael and Becky returned once again to the old oak tree behind Lincoln High School. It had become their sanctuary, untouched by the noise and expectations of everyday life. The enormous branches stretched high above them, casting long shadows across the ground as the afternoon sun slowly descended toward the horizon. Michael reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small pocket knife. Carefully, he knelt beside the massive trunk and carved a tiny heart no larger than the palm of his hand. Inside it, he etched the initials MT and RH. Becky laughed softly, pretending to scold him for marking such a beautiful tree, but moments later she knelt beside him and gently placed her hand over the carving. She whispered that long after they were gone, perhaps decades into the future, someone might notice those initials and wonder about the two young people who had left them there. Michael smiled and replied that maybe one day they would return together as an old married couple and show their grandchildren exactly where they had promised each other forever. Becky closed her eyes for a moment before quietly repeating the promise they had first made months earlier. No matter what happened, no matter where life took them, they would always find their way back to each other. Those words settled into the silence beneath the old oak tree, carried away by a gentle spring breeze. Neither of them could have imagined that within only a matter of weeks, those promises would be tested in a way no 17-year-old could have anticipated. Without warning, life was preparing to separate them, not for months, not for years, but for 45 long years. And when the moment finally arrived, it would leave one heart searching and the other waiting, each believing they had been forgotten by the person they loved most. The final months of senior year are often remembered as the happiest season of youth, a brief period when adulthood feels close enough to imagine, but still far enough away that every ordinary day carries a sense of possibility. For 17-year-old Michael Turner and 17-year-old Rebecca Becky Hayes, the spring of 1978 seemed to unfold exactly that way. Every morning they walked through the front doors of Lincoln High School believing they were counting down not only to graduation, but to the beginning of the life they had carefully planned together. They talked endlessly about the future with the confidence that only young people possess. Michael often joked that one day he would own the busiest auto repair shop in Maplewood, while Becky laughed and insisted she would fill his waiting room with drawings made by the children she hoped to teach. They discussed what kind of house they wanted, agreeing that it didn't need to be large as long as it had a wide front porch, a backyard big enough for children to play, and an old oak tree somewhere nearby. Michael even teased that he would build Becky a wooden porch swing with his own hands so they could sit together every evening after work and watch the sunset just as they did now. To anyone overhearing those conversations, they sounded less like teenagers dreaming about tomorrow and more like a couple already planning their retirement together. It was impossible to imagine that every dream they described would soon be interrupted by circumstances neither of them had the power to control. One Saturday afternoon, Maplewood held its annual Spring Festival, an event that brought together nearly every family in town. Booths lined Main Street. Local musicians performed country songs from a temporary stage. Children ran between carnival games carrying brightly colored balloons, and the smell of fresh popcorn, grilled hamburgers, and homemade apple pies drifted through the warm afternoon air. Michael and Becky spent nearly the entire day there, laughing as they competed at simple carnival games neither of them was particularly good at. Michael eventually won a small stuffed bear after far more attempts than he cared to admit, proudly presenting it to Becky as though he had just claimed an Olympic gold medal. Becky laughed so hard that tears formed in her eyes before hugging the little bear tightly against her chest. She joked that one day she would place it on a shelf in their future home, so she could remind Michael how many dollars he had spent trying to win a prize worth only a few cents. Michael smiled and replied that every dollar had been worthwhile if it made her laugh that way. An elderly couple sitting nearby happened to overhear the conversation. The husband smiled warmly before telling Michael to hold on tightly to a woman who could still laugh at life's smallest moments, because those were the people who made the hardest years worth surviving. At the time, Michael simply thanked the man for his advice without giving it much thought. Decades later, those words would return to him with astonishing clarity. As the festival drew to a close that evening, fireworks illuminated the sky above Maplewood. Michael and Becky found themselves standing together on a grassy hill overlooking the town as bursts of red, blue, and gold reflected in their eyes. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. They simply stood side by side, hands intertwined, watching the celebration unfold in comfortable silence. Finally, Becky rested her head gently against Michael's shoulder and asked him a question that seemed almost unnecessary. She wanted to know whether he had ever imagined spending his entire life with one person. Michael didn't hesitate. He admitted that before meeting her, he had never thought much about marriage or growing old. Those ideas belonged to a distant future. But somewhere during the previous several months, his plans had quietly changed. Now, every future he imagined included Becky standing beside him. He confessed that he no longer thought in terms of my life. Instead, he had begun thinking about our life. Becky smiled, tears quietly gathering in her eyes, before whispering that she had been hoping he felt the same way because she had already begun praying every night that they would never lose each other. Michael gently kissed her forehead and promised that nothing would ever separate them. It was a promise made with complete sincerity because neither of them knew that some of life's greatest obstacles are not created by distance, lack of love, or betrayal, but by decisions made in rooms where the people most affected are never invited to speak. Behind the warmth and optimism surrounding their relationship, however, small cracks had begun appearing in Becky's family life. Her father had become unusually quiet over the previous several weeks. He often returned home later than usual, carrying a leather briefcase filled with paperwork he refused to discuss during dinner. Telephone calls interrupted family meals, and conversations between her parents frequently ended the moment Becky entered the room. Although she sensed something important was happening, every question she asked received the same reassuring answer. Her parents insisted there was nothing she needed to worry about and encouraged her to focus on school, graduation, and college applications. Becky wanted to believe them, yet an uneasy feeling settled deep inside her heart. One evening, she mentioned those concerns to Michael while they sat beneath the old oak tree behind Lincoln High School. Michael listened carefully before gently reminding her that parents often carried burdens they tried to shield their children from. He encouraged her not to assume the worst, promising that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together just as they had faced everything else. Becky smiled, grateful for his steady optimism, but something inside her refused to quiet down. She could not explain why, but she felt as though time itself had begun moving faster, as though an invisible clock was counting down toward a moment neither of them could yet see. Meanwhile, completely unknown to both 17-year-old Michael Turner and 17-year-old Rebecca Becky Hayes, events were unfolding that would permanently alter the course of their lives. Hundreds of miles away, executives at a manufacturing company had finalized plans to restructure several regional offices. One of those decisions involved offering Becky's father a significant promotion that required an immediate relocation to another state. It was the opportunity he had spent years hoping would arrive, one that promised financial security, career advancement, and a future he believed would benefit his entire family. To him, Accepting the position seemed obvious. He convinced himself that temporary disappointment would eventually be forgotten once Becky adjusted to her new surroundings and focused on college. What he underestimated was the depth of the bond his daughter had built with Michael. More importantly, he underestimated the lasting consequences of believing he knew what was best without asking the one person whose future would be changed forever. The official paperwork had already been signed. The moving company had already been contacted. Plans were quietly falling into place while Michael and Becky continued discussing graduation celebrations, summer picnics, and the life they believed was waiting patiently just beyond the final day of high school. The first unmistakable sign that something had changed came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Michael waited outside the school entrance, exactly as he did every day, expecting Becky to emerge carrying her stack of textbooks and smiling the moment she spotted him. Students gradually disappeared into waiting cars or began walking home with friends, yet Becky never appeared. Assuming she had stayed behind to speak with a teacher, Michael waited another 15 minutes before checking the library, the gymnasium, and the parking lot. She was nowhere to be found. Eventually, one of Becky's classmates mentioned she had been called to the principal's office shortly before the final bell. Michael accepted the explanation without concern, believing there would be a simple reason for her unexpected absence. He had no way of knowing that this ordinary afternoon marked the beginning of the mystery that would haunt him for the next 45 years. The life he and Becky had planned together was about to change forever, and neither of them yet realized they were only days away from saying goodbye, without ever knowing it would be goodbye.